All right, so I'm getting still lots of great comments and questions on my videos on pragmatic swordsmanship. Thank you, everyone. These are inspiring, well, even more video topics, and bear with me, I'm trying to keep up. Today I want to address some comments and questions about, well, paths of returning the Japanese sword. And for me, they fall into three categories. Now, I've got another video on length of sword stroke because I use short, medium, and, well, longish cuts, and that's certainly going to make a difference. Another thing that's going to make a difference is whether I'm using one-handed versus two-handed technique or combinations of the above. So, get a couple of caveats out of the way. Caveat number one, as usual, I don't consider myself any kind of expert master, anything like that. This is just based on my experience and application. Hopefully it's useful, beneficial, or at least stimulates, again, even more conversation. Caveat number two, I never, ever, ever intend to contradict anything you're being taught in whatever system you're learning or practicing. If that's working for you, it's working for you. Stick with it. Let's share knowledge. I am also still learning and evolving. But basically, different styles, different techniques, I found used, as I say, a couple of different methods for returning the sword. And I tend to focus on three. So let's break them down. All right, the first and what I consider the most primary method is returning the blade along its same path, basically rewinding it, shall we say. This is something I use in repetitive cut training and also when I'm doing some of those really short cuts or maybe even some of the medium length cuts when that angle makes sense in the form, kata technique, whatever I'm doing. But this is also one that's extremely useful to train cuts for a beginner. What am I talking about? I'm talking about doing a cut to whatever length, right? Could be short, medium, long. But as you see, I am reversing the cut without changing my blade angle. So I'm returning it with the spine. Now again, this can be, at least in my head, not only very useful for training repeated cuts, right? Building up those muscles. And again, you tend to use more strength stopping a sword than propelling it. So you can certainly train that. We'll talk about injury prevention later because, yeah, it's a high risk for tendinitis if you overdo it. But also, again, in some of those shortcuts, yeah, some of those quick returns, being able to bring the sword back along its own path before turning it into a new one can be a very effective cutting technique. Or not. What are your other options? Okay, so option two is a circular action, and I'm kind of going with degree of difficulty here. And also what you tend to see in different kinds of kata, different kinds of forms, different kinds of styles, koryu. Some of them favor this. Now, some of them favor it strictly as a cutting technique. I always consider this a combination technique. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a situation where you make a cut, but instead of returning the sword on the same path that it cut with, you turn usually from the wrists and hands, and then everything else gets behind that, and the sword changes lines. Okay? So instead of going like this, it will move into the next movement in more of a curved angle. So if I'm facing the target, instead of bringing the sword back and in, I'm going to come in and move it in another angle. Now, you can certainly just cut through, keep going, and come back around. Some styles will do cuts that are like that, and I can't really do them very effectively because there's not a lot of room here to make a big cut through, circle around, and come back. And there may be other ways to do that, other techniques, depending on the system that you're studying, where, yeah, there's a lot more cut through And it doesn't have to be a direct circle. You can certainly change lines and do all sorts of different kinds of butterfly sort of things. But when I apply this, I also consider what I'm doing tactically. So it's not usually just a cut and then change lines. I'm considering where the parries could be and where in the middle of doing this I could alter my technique to respond to what the opponent's doing. So for instance, in my videos on Pragmatic EI, I demonstrated, that rising slash in several videos as a great example of technique. Yeah, I might bring that into some different angles of attack, which could also be parries. So it's not just a matter of cutting and then cutting in a different direction. I'm considering what I could be doing in combination. You'll also notice I'm trying not to break that concept of the wall I brought up in another video, not letting the sword get too much behind me in most situations, but sometimes these circular returns will do that a little bit more than others. Okay, so inline, circular, returns. You can certainly see how they can combine together for different kinds of tactics and combinations. What's your third option? All right, before we get into option 3, revisiting the first two very briefly to talk about edge alignment, because it's going to be critical in number 3. The first method, the simplest method, returning the blade directly along its path by basically reversing it, is probably the easiest to maintain edge alignment. Whereas the circular one is probably one of the easiest to screw up your edge alignment. You got to make sure before you initiate the cut that you stabilize your edge alignment, because you've basically taken the sword out of edge alignment during that transitional movement or parry. This can also come up in this third action, which makes this third action, well, it's considered to actually be one of the most effective methods of returning a sword in terms of, well, being tactically devastating. But it's also, in my head, my experience, one of the most challenging to get down, especially if you're talking about, well, not only developing the strength of the technique, but also managing to control edge alignment. Now, I'll use this one anywhere from a short stroke to a medium stroke to even a long stroke. But what we're talking about is doing the cut. You're going to return the sword along the same path, but you're going to turn the edge so it's going primary edge into the cut both ways. I've already demonstrated this, for instance, in my Pragmatic Musashi, where I talked about cutting downwards and then cutting upwards. And in this situation, I'm using the clock angles of 11 and 1. Okay, so I can do that really short, or I can do it longer. But the idea is I have to make a clean turn and make sure I have that edge alignment coming back. Now, this one started with a cut from above and then stopped with a cut from below. We'll talk about cuts from below. They tend to be a lot more challenging. His left side cut tends to be more from that 8 o'clock to the 2 o'clock, where you're talking here to here. Okay, so I'm cutting this way, turning, cutting right back on the same path. With one hand, it's a little bit easy to do in certain angles than others. One of the things you're going to see is, well, we'll talk about this in other videos, what kind of cutting angles along this path can kind of bind you up and therefore tend to be freer when you're doing it with one hand versus two. Now, this also could potentially limit how many angles you can go at depending on how well you can move. For instance, straight vertical doesn't return upwards very easily. This one, like I said, that 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock works really good. And I'm using a very short cut because my computer's in the way. Doing a 1 o'clock coming back from a 7. Now you'll notice because my wrists entangle a little bit more, that transition's a little bit more difficult with two hands. So on this angle, I tend to favor, as I said, 2 o'clock and returning on the 8. On this angle, yeah, I could certainly do a 4 o'clock and return on the 10, or vice versa. Can I do a straight horizontal? We'll talk about how I feel about the straight horizontal 3 to 9s, but yes, I certainly can. The idea is these are often used in quick combinations, and I'll talk about these returns in another video, and I already kind of introduced them in my Musashi video, where the idea is that initial cut becomes feint, parry, slash, and then you actually put more decisiveness in the second part. Okay? So you are actually using a timing rhythm that allows you to reverse that really fast, catching the opponent off guard because he was reacting to your first cut, and then suddenly you're coming up with another one into an angle where he's open. Again, we'll talk about this in another video in terms of application, but you can already see how challenging this particular combination can be in training. So high investment, potentially very, very high payoff. These are also combinations, all of them, that can be done in your tamashigiri practice. It's not just about kata or about fencing. Obviously, you'll change your focus and really be working on power, speed, and edge alignment. Whether you're talking about, more straight cutting angles with the return from the spine, whether you're talking about more circular transitions to do your cutting combinations, or you're talking about that linear edge reversal return. All can be used in tamashigiri. And for you guys who practice tamashigiri, you already know what the challenges are. So let's get that conversation going in the comments. What do you use? What do you like? What do you not like? Where are you having issues? Where are you excelling? And as usual, I hope this was useful information, and I hope to see you again. Surprise bonus content, since you've all been such a wonderful audience. What about these return techniques with other kinds of swords? Well, if you're talking about a single-edged or mostly single-edged saber, it's really not going to be any different than the use of the katana in any of these techniques, because you're primarily using your true edge. I'll talk a little bit about false edge here in a second, because your saber might have a little bit of a false edge. Double-edged weapon. Starting with a one-hand version, well, again, 2 of the 3 methods not going to be much different. If I am using that third method, cutting, turning my true edge over and cutting back with my true edge, yeah, it's pretty much going to be the same. If I'm cutting with my true edge and then doing a circular movement to cut from another angle with my true edge, yeah, it's pretty much going to be the same. Not much different. Obviously, length and curve and weight and balance and all those things play into the dynamics of, any sword. But where things start to shine is in that first, most basic method where I'm cutting with true edge and now potentially returning with a false edge cut. Yeah, that can be a quick, devastating return. Now, if you've ever practiced any cutting with your false edge, whether you're talking about a straight sword or a curved saber, with one hand, you know that you can't get a whole lot of power out of that cut, and under impact, this is actually a great way to rip the sword out of your own hand. Which is why it's different if you're talking about a two-handed double-edged sword like a long sword. That's why back edge cuts are so much more popular with the long sword. Now, I don't have enough room in here to try it with a long sword to show you anything, but sort of the next best thing. Let's take a look at double-edged katana. Again, if I'm turning true edge over, no different. If I'm cutting using a circular path to change the angle of my cut, no different, but again, going back to that first simplest technique, cut and return. Yeah, that can be a quick, sudden, effective slasher cut into an opening that I create with that initial movement. Can be very effective. Also allows me to finally take advantage of that vertical I was struggling with, where, coming back up straight, coming up with the back edge is a lot easier than coming up straight by turning that edge over. It's not a terribly strong cut. That's not bad. Let's take it one step further. Going back to the humble Shinogi Zukiri. No back edge, but don't discount your back edge and your tip. If you quickly return, you can create a wounding action that can wind through somebody's guard quite effectively. Don't discount what it can do. Is it going to be a major cut? No, but it can be effective, distracting, discouraging, disabling action. And one of the things you can use to make it even better is that can set up to turn into a thrusting action. So don't discount the back and the back of the tip of your Shinogi Zukiri Katana.